What we are witnessing in this moment is not just another headline-driven disagreement between two political figures. It is a defining clash of leadership styles, economic strategy, and national posture, a dispute that reveals how preparation, institutional discipline, and financial leverage can collide head-on with impulse-driven politics and public spectacle. At the center of this standoff are Donald Trump and Mark Carney, two men representing vastly different approaches to power. One thrives on confrontation, rapid escalation, and public dominance. The other operates with methodical precision, data-backed arguments, and carefully timed institutional responses. When those styles meet under high geopolitical tension, the result is not subtle. It begins with provocation. Trump, known for using social media as a primary political weapon, launched a series of aggressive statements aimed directly at Carney and Canada. The language was sharp, personal, and dismissive. He accused Canada of unfair economic practices, suggested punitive measures, and floated the idea of leveraging America's financial dominance to pressure Ottawa into compliance. The tone was unmistakable: dominance over dialogue. But here is where the dynamic shifted in an unexpected way. Instead of responding immediately, instead of matching rhetoric with rhetoric, Carney went silent. For nearly 2 days, there was no reactive statement, no emotional counterattack, no escalating headline. In a political culture that rewards instant response, silence can feel like weakness. Critics speculated. Commentators filled airtime. Social media churned with interpretations. Then Carney spoke, and when he did, the contrast was stark. Standing before Canada's Parliament, Carney delivered a composed, data-driven address that dismantled the economic claims underlying Trump's attacks. He did not rely on personal insults. He did not amplify emotional tension. Instead, he laid out numbers: trade flows, capital exposure, energy dependencies, treaty obligations. Each point methodically built a case that the economic interdependence between the United States and Canada is not one-sided. He challenged the premise that Washington held all the leverage. One of the central issues in the dispute revolved around banking restrictions. Trump's comments had implied that the United States could tighten financial access in ways that would significantly hurt Canada. Carney's rebuttal flipped that narrative. He explained that restricting Canadian financial institutions would not isolate damage to Canada alone. American lenders, investors, and pension funds are deeply entangled with Canadian markets. Any aggressive restriction would reverberate back into U.S. financial stability. In other words, pressure would not flow in one direction. Then came the energy dimension. Trump floated the possibility of freezing Canadian crude imports, suggesting that such a move would pressure Ottawa without severe domestic cost. Carney's response again relied on data. Canadian crude feeds critical American refineries, particularly in states where infrastructure is calibrated specifically for that supply. A freeze would not simply shift imports overnight. It would disrupt pricing structures, increase gasoline costs, and create ripple effects in regions that are politically significant within the United States. This was not a theoretical argument. It was logistical reality. The next escalation point involved the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade framework governing North American commerce. Trump hinted at unilateral withdrawal mechanisms. Carney countered by outlining the legal architecture of that agreement. Withdrawal is not instantaneous. It requires formal notice periods, procedural steps, and congressional involvement. It is not a button that can be pressed in response to a social media dispute. That clarification shifted the conversation from political theater to institutional constraint. But Carney did not stop at rebuttal. He announced targeted countermeasures. These were not blanket tariffs designed to inflame broad sectors. They were strategically calibrated economic responses aimed at politically sensitive regions within the United States. Agricultural exports from specific states, potash supplies vital to farming industries, pipeline capacity reviews affecting cross-border energy flows. Each measure was structured to maximize leverage while maintaining plausible adherence to international trade rules. This is where the narrative transformed from reaction to strategy. Rather than appearing cornered, Canada appeared prepared. Investors noticed. Markets began adjusting in real time. Currency fluctuations reflected shifting confidence. Energy stocks reacted to pipeline review announcements. Agricultural futures ticked in response to export suspensions. Financial analysts began modeling capital reallocation scenarios. And then came one of the most discussed signals of the entire episode: sovereign risk diversification. Carney accelerated policies encouraging Canadian pension funds and institutional investors to diversify holdings away from concentrated American exposure. This was not framed as punishment, it was framed as prudence. But the implication was clear: Canada would not leave itself vulnerable to sudden political volatility. Capital flows are among the most powerful forces in modern geopolitics. When large institutional investors adjust allocations, markets respond. Allies began weighing in as well. Within 90 minutes of Carney's address, several allied nations expressed support for Canada's position, emphasizing the importance of stable trade relationships and rule-based economic systems. This was not merely symbolic. It signaled that unilateral pressure tactics could carry reputational consequences beyond the immediate bilateral dispute. Perhaps the most unexpected commentary came from the financial world. Warren Buffett, a figure whose words carry immense weight in investment circles, offered an observation that resonated widely. Markets, he suggested, price assets based on competence and predictability. Leadership perceived as disciplined and data-driven tends to reduce risk premiums. Leadership perceived as volatile increases them. That framing reframed the entire standoff as not just political, but financial. By the close of trading, market reactions told a subtle but meaningful story. The US dollar showed signs of short-term weakness. Canadian equities demonstrated resilience, particularly in sectors insulated from American retaliation. Agricultural stocks in targeted U.S. states felt pressure. Energy markets adjusted cautiously. None of this amounted to economic collapse, but it demonstrated something critical. Economic warfare in an interconnected system rarely produces clean victories. So where does this leave the broader question? Is this merely a dispute amplified by rhetoric? Or is it a recalibration of North American power dynamics? At its core, the conflict illustrates the tension between two governing philosophies. One prioritizes speed, dominance, and spectacle. The other prioritizes preparation, institutional alignment, and measured escalation. Trump's initial gambit relied on shock value and perceived American leverage. Carney's counter relied on exposing interdependence and preparing counterweights. The broader lesson for global observers is significant. In a world where major economies are tightly intertwined, coercive economic tactics carry self-inflicted risk. Supply chains, capital markets, and energy grids do not respect political bravado. There is also a domestic political dimension on both sides. For Trump, projecting strength against foreign leaders plays well with segments of his base. It reinforces a narrative of America first assertiveness. But if that assertiveness translates into higher gasoline prices, agricultural strain, or market volatility, political costs could emerge quickly. For Carney, standing firm reinforces national sovereignty and competence. Canadians historically rally around leaders who defend autonomy against external pressure. But prolonged economic disruption would test that support. The most intriguing aspect of this episode is the choreography. Carney's silence before response was strategic. It allowed markets to process the initial shock without Canadian escalation. It signaled restraint. When he finally spoke, the contrast amplified the impact. Preparation appeared to outmaneuver impulse. That perception may prove as important as any specific tariff or trade clause. In geopolitics, reputation compounds over time. A leader viewed as methodical gains negotiating capital. A leader viewed as unpredictable may gain short-term leverage, but risk long-term trust erosion. The coming weeks will determine whether this confrontation de-escalates through quiet negotiation or hardens into sustained economic friction. Behind closed doors, advisors on both sides are undoubtedly assessing off-ramps. Trade negotiators understand that prolonged uncertainty damages both economies. Security officials recognize that strategic coordination matters beyond trade disputes. Political strategists are calculating electoral implications. It is possible that this dramatic exchange ultimately leads to a recalibrated agreement, strengthened communication channels, and clearer boundaries. It is also possible that it marks the beginning of a more transactional and less assumption-based North American relationship. What cannot be denied is the symbolism of the moment. A U.S. president attempted to assert unilateral leverage. A Canadian prime minister responded not with emotional counterattack, but with institutional power, economic data, and targeted countermeasures. Markets reacted not to rhetoric alone, but to perceived competence. Allies signaled alignment with stability over volatility, and observers worldwide witnessed a case study in how mid-sized powers can defend sovereignty within highly integrated systems. The deeper question moving forward is whether impulse or preparation proves more sustainable as a governing model in a globalized era. Economic interdependence makes total victory unlikely for either side. Mutual damage is easier to achieve than unilateral gain. If there is a resolution, it will likely come not through public ultimatums, but through negotiated recalibration, quiet diplomacy, restoring equilibrium after public turbulence. Until then, the contrast remains vivid. Provocation met with preparation, spectacle met with structure, and a reminder that in modern geopolitics, leverage is rarely as one-sided as it first appears. This dispute may fade from headlines in weeks or months, or it may become a defining example studied by policymakers and economists for years, a moment when leadership style itself became the central variable in a high-stakes economic standoff. Either way, the lesson is clear. In a world where markets respond instantly and alliances matter deeply, preparation can be just as powerful as provocation, and sometimes far more enduring.